Imagine standing on the muddy bank of a dark river at night. The air is thick. It's that oppressive, suffocating humidity of the deep south, where every breath feels heavy with salt, river mud, and the faint, sweet rot of dead vegetation. Vanished moss drapes from the cypress trees like funeral veils, barely moving in the stagnant air. The water is black ink, reflecting nothing but a sliver of a crescent moon. You're just trying to unwind after a brutal, bone-aching day of manual labor. You've got a fishing rod in your hand. Your line is cast into the dark water. The world is quiet. Your mind is finally starting to drift. And then the night breaks. A strange buzzing sound slices through the crickets. The temperature plummets. In the middle of a humid October night, your breath begins to fog. Strange blue lights pulse across the surface of the water, and from the black sky above the river, something impossible descends. Welcome back to YercLore. We chase the shadows that most people run from. We dig into the cases that blur the lines between reality and the impossible, connecting the dots that lead straight into the unknown. Today, we're heading into the humid heart of the Deep South, my home state of Mississippi. The year is 1973. America is drowning in the paranoia of the Watergate scandal, the anxiety of the looming oil crisis, and the lingering, bitter scars of the Vietnam War. But down in Pascagoula, Mississippi, the national news didn't matter as much as the local shipyard. Pascagoula was a gritty, blue-collar town. It was defined by the Ingalls shipping building yard. Thousands of men spent their days welding steel for massive Navy warships and oil tankers. It was a place of calloused hands, deafening metal clangs, and blinding sparks. It was a town of hard facts and built on hard labor. But by night, the river that snaked past those shipyards turned into pure southern Gothic. Fogs rolling off the water, twisted trees, complete, haunting isolation. This is the story of Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker. On the night of October 11th, 1973, these two ordinary shipyard workers became the center of one of the most credible, terrifying, and fiercely debated alien abduction cases in human history. This wasn't a weather balloon, this wasn't swamp gas, and tonight we are going to look at the evidence. We're going to go over the secret police tapes, and we are going to stare directly into the abyss. Before we get into the river, we have to look at our witnesses, because in cases like this, when the claims are extraordinary, credibility is everything. Charles Hickson, who went by Charlie, was 42 years old, and he was a foreman at the shipyard. Charlie was a veteran of the Korean War. He was a family man, and the kind of guy who fixed his problems with a wrench and not his words. He had zero history of telling tall tales. He was respected by the men under him. He was steady, the kind of man who did not rattle easily. With him was Calvin Parker. Calvin was just 19 years old. He worked under Charlie's wing as a pipe fitter. Calvin was just a kid and just starting his life. He was engaged to be married. He was saving up for a house, looking for that simple, stable American dream. He had just moved down from a much smaller town to get a good paying job at the yard. These were not UFO chasers. They didn't subscribe to sci-fi magazines. They didn't care about the paranormal. They were just two exhausted guys who clocked out of a loud, dirty, back-breaking shift and wanted to catch some catfish before going to bed. It was around 9 p.m. They had driven down to an abandoned, dilapidated pier on the west bank of the Pascagoula River. It was private property, technically part of the shipyard, but locals knew it was a sweet spot for fishing. The sun had long set. The lines were in the water. They might have been talking about work, or maybe they were just sitting in comfortable silence, listening to the water lap against the wood. Then Calvin noticed it. It wasn't a light at first, it was a sound, a zipping, whirling vibration. Charlie later described it as the sound of a high voltage transformer, but angry, insistent. It wasn't just in the air, they could feel the vibrations in the wooden pier beneath their boots. The air around them physically changed. The heavy humidity vanished, replaced by an unnatural, bone-chilling cold. They looked upriver, and about 300 yards out, flashing blue lights were zigzagging through the sky. They weren't moving like a helicopter, and they certainly weren't a plane. The lights converged, dropping lower and lower, until they hovered just 2 feet above the dark water of the Pascagoula River. The craft was shaped like an egg, maybe 30 to 40 feet across, glowing with a sickly, inner, blue-white luminescence. There were no seams on the metal, no rivets, no propellers, no exhaust, just that mind-numbing hum. And then a slit opened in the side of the egg. A blinding, pure white light poured out onto the riverbank, washing over Charlie and Calvin. If your survival instincts kick in, you run. It's called fight or flight. But they couldn't do either. A wave of absolute, terrifying paralysis hit both men. Their muscles locked. Their feet were glued to the mud. Calvin Parker was so completely overwhelmed by the sheer terror of what he was looking at that his brain simply shut off to protect itself. He fainted, collapsing backwards onto the wooden pier, but Charlie stayed awake. He couldn't move his arms or legs, but his eyes were wide open. He watched as three figures emerged from the blinding light of the craft. They didn't walk, they glided, hovering inches above the ground. They moved towards the paralyzed men. They were about 5 feet tall, with skin that looked like pale, wrinkled parchment or gray elephant hide. They had no necks. Their heads sat directly on their shoulders. Where a nose should be, there were three carrot-like protrusions, slits for eyes, a thin gash for a mouth. But the most horrifying detail, the detail that haunted Charlie for the rest of his life, were the hands. They didn't have fingers, they had pincers, crab-like metallic claws that clicked open and closed as they floated towards them. They weren't acting out of malice, they weren't angry. It was worse. It was cold, silent efficiency, like machines collecting soil samples. One of the entities floated to Charlie, its claws extending. The moment those pincers clamped onto his arms, Charlie felt himself becoming entirely weightless. Gravity ceased to exist, and he floated up, off the dirt, and pulled through the glowing slit of the craft. He couldn't turn his head, but he knew another entity was dragging the unconscious body of a young Calvin Parker right beside him. Once inside, Charlie found himself in a sterile, brightly lit circular room. The light didn't come from bulbs, it seemed to radiate from the walls themselves. There were no chairs, no screens, no visible instruments. He was floated onto an invisible, table-like surface in the center of the room. He couldn't move his neck, but in his peripheral vision he saw a device descend from the ceiling. It looked like a massive mechanical eye, a floating lens. It hovered above him, systematically scanning his body from head to toe. There was no physical pain, but Charlie later described it as a total violation of his soul. He was being dissected without being cut open. Time lost all meaning. Was he in there for 10 minutes? An hour? The entities never spoke a single word. There was no communication, only the hum and the blinding light. And then, as abruptly as it began, it was over. Charlie and Calvin were floated back out of the craft, their boots hitting the muddy riverbank. The egg-shaped ship ascended silently into the night sky, its blue lights flashing, and vanished into the atmosphere. When Calvin woke up, he was screaming. He was on his knees in the mud, weeping, convinced he had died. Charlie was trembling, desperately trying to calm the teenager down. They stumbled into their car. Charlie sat behind the wheel, staring into the dark, and drank half a bottle of whiskey from his glove box just to stop his hands from shaking. They debated going home. Who would ever believe them? They'd be locked in an asylum, or laughed out of town. But Charlie, as a Korean War vet, felt a sense of duty. If there was a threat in that river, if there was some kind of secret weapon, the authorities needed to know. So at 10:30 p.m., they walked into the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. They spoke to Sheriff Fred Diamond and Captain Glenn Ryder. The cops took one look at these guys and immediately thought it was a hoax, or that they were blind drunk. But as they interviewed them separately, the cops noticed something unsettling. Their stories matched perfectly, down to the exact clicking sounds of the claws, and neither man smelled like booze aside from the swig Charlie took in the car after the event. Sheriff Diamond decided to test them. He put Charlie and Calvin in an interrogation room together, told them he'd be right back, and walked out. But he left the hidden tape recorder running. The sheriff fully expected them to drop the act. He expected to hear them laugh or conspire to keep their story straight. Instead, the hidden microphone captured the raw, unfiltered terror of two men whose reality has just been shattered. Now forgive me here, as I'm going to act out the dialogue between these two men. Or at least try to act it out, so, pace along, I guess. Mm-mm. Calvin, pacing the room, hyperventilating. I got to get home, give me some nerve pills, or to see a doctor. I cannot stand it. I'm about to go half crazy. Charlie tried to comfort him, his voice thick with exhaustion. When we're through, I'll get you something to settle you down. Calvin couldn't stop. I passed out. I ain't never passed out in my life. You see how that damn door come right up? Them sons of bitches just came right out. Oh God, it's awful. I know there's a God up there. Charlie replied softly, sounding defeated. I've never seen nothing like that. You can't make people believe. They won't believe. They ain't ever gonna believe it. But they might believe it one day. But it might also be too late. And that concludes my horrible acting. But listen to the context of those words. They are entirely alone. There is no audience. If this was a prank, if they were trying to get famous, this was the exact moment they would have dropped the facade. When Sheriff Diamond listened to that tape, a chill went down his spine. He later told the press if they were lying, they ought to be in Hollywood. This wasn't a hoax. Whatever they saw on that riverbank, they truly believed it happened. By the next morning, the secret was out. A dispatcher leaked the story to the press, and Pascagoula became ground zero for a media frenzy. Reporters swarmed the shipyard, news vans parked on their lawns. Charlie and Calvin were mocked, harassed, and interrogated by the nation. And that's when the heavy hitters arrived. Dr. J. Allen Hyneks flew into town. If you know UFO lore, you know Hyneks. He was an astronomer and the former lead scientific consultant for the U.S. Air Force's Project Blue Book. He was a professional skeptic whose literal job had been to debunk UFO sightings for the United States government. Hynek interviewed both men extensively. He subjected them to rigorous questioning. His conclusions stunned the press. Hynek stated publicly, "There is simply no question in my mind that these men have had a very real, frightening experience. They are absolutely honest." But that wasn't enough for the skeptics. They brought in a polygraph expert, John Holcomb. The operator for the local police department strapped Charles Hickson to a lie detector. He was asked point blank if he fabricated the ship, the entities, and the abduction. He passed with flying colors. The polygraph operator noted that Charlie was in a state of extreme psychological trauma, but he was telling the absolute truth as his brain processed it. Calvin was so deeply traumatized that they couldn't even get a stable baseline reading to test him. There was also a military angle that the government quickly tried to sweep under the rug. On the exact same night of the abduction, radar operators at nearby Kessler Air Force Base in Biloxi, Mississippi, tracked an unidentified object moving at an impossible speed. It hovered over the Gulf Coast right near Pascagoula before vanishing from the screens. Was it the egg? The Air Force refused to elaborate. Skeptics have tried to tear this case apart for 50 years. They call it sleep paralysis. They called it a shared hallucination. They say Charlie made it up for money. But here's the harsh reality. This event did not bring them wealth, it brought them ruin. Calvin Parker suffered multiple nervous breakdowns. The PTSD was so severe he couldn't hold down a job. He moved out of the state, changed his name, and tried to hide from the world for decades just to escape the mockery and to escape the nightmares. Charlie Hickson wrote a book, but he faced constant ridicule from the town he helped build. People would mock him in the grocery store. If it was a lie, a grift, or a joke, people eventually confess. The weight of a lie that big crushes you over decades. But Charles Hickson died in 2011, and Parker passed away in 2023. And all the way to their deathbeds, looking their families in the eyes at the very end of their lives, and neither man ever changed a single detail of their story, not one word of it. So what really happened in the muddy waters of the Pascagoula River? Were two shipyard workers pulled into an interstellar laboratory? Were they victims of a classified military psychological experiment? Or is there something ancient and alien living in the depths of the Gulf of Mexico? The tapes are real, the trauma was real, and the river isn't talking. So next time you find yourself near dark, still waters at night, just listen closely. If the crickets suddenly go quiet and you hear a buzz vibrating in your teeth, don't look up, run. If you made it this far down the rabbit hole, go ahead and hit subscribe. Leave a comment below on what you want to hear about next. Do you believe Charlie and Calvin, or is the mind capable of inventing its own monsters? As always, stay easy, and I'll see you next time.